This is not an argument. It is not a warning. And it is not a call to action. This is a quiet story about how authority changes shape, not how it falls, not how it is overthrown, but how it continues after it has stopped convincing. You do not need to agree with what follows. You only need to stay long enough for the pattern to become visible. Authority did not collapse suddenly. It continued to function. Orders were issued. Courts convened. Decrees were signed. Uniforms were worn. The machinery of rule operated with familiar precision. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. The rituals of power repeated themselves without interruption. And yet, something essential had slipped. Authority still existed. It no longer convinced. People obeyed because consequences were visible, not because obedience resolved anything internally. Compliance became procedural rather than internal. The act was completed correctly, but it no longer settled the mind. Following rules ceased to quiet doubt. This distinction mattered more than it appeared. When obedience loses internal assent, it does not disappear. It hollows. Behavior remains intact, but confidence drains out of it. People continue to do what is required while quietly wondering what would happen if the structure itself stopped making sense. At first, this feels manageable. Doubt is private. Hesitation is silent. Questions are postponed rather than spoken. Life continues, but with an added weight. Decisions that once felt self-evident begin to require justification. Authority still enforces behavior, but it no longer absorbs uncertainty. This produces a specific strain. Not rebellion, not refusal, withdrawal. The surface of life remains orderly, but inwardly certainty thins. People comply, yet something remains unresolved after each act of obedience. The rules no longer explain themselves. They demand compliance without offering reassurance. Fear does not erupt under these conditions. It accumulates. It settles into hesitation, into repetition, into the constant need to check and recheck decisions that once required no deliberation. People look for confirmation, not because instructions are unclear, but because trust in those instructions has weakened. This is not panic. It is compression. The feeling that something is wrong, paired with the inability to name it without sounding disloyal, irrational, or unstable. The sense that every decision carries more weight than it should, and that no one can say why. The result is tension without language. No ideology has formed yet. No alternative explanation has arrived. There is only the awareness that the old words no longer reach the pressure people feel. The language of authority still circulates, but it no longer fits lived experience. This is the condition before rupture. not disbelief. Uncertainty, not collapse. Unease, and unease, left unaddressed, begins to suffocate. At a certain point, the effort of holding everything together becomes visible. People begin to sense that they are managing appearances rather than meaning. That order persists only because everyone continues to perform it. This realization is quiet, but it is heavy. Anxiety does not ask whether something is true. It asks whether something will hold, whether anyone understands what is happening beneath the surface, whether there exists any presence capable of restoring the sense of order that feels real rather than imposed. Certainty becomes more valuable than accuracy. And when certainty cannot be found in institutions, it begins to search elsewhere. When authority loses its power to reassure, rules alone cannot compensate. People do not abandon structure immediately. They cling to it. Procedures multiply. Formality increases. On the surface, order appears to strengthen. Compliance becomes stricter. Deviations narrow. The system looks more disciplined than before. Internally, confidence continues to drain. This is where substitution begins, not through ideas, through presence. Explanations arrive too slowly for fear. Doctrine lags behind anxiety. What people seek first is not meaning, but relief. Not justification, but the sense that someone sees what others are pretending not to notice. Reassurance becomes valuable before belief collapses. Power begins to shift toward those who appear composed rather than correct, toward voices that do not hesitate, toward figures who speak without qualification, without the visible strain that now accompanies official authority. Nothing new needs to be said. It only needs to be said without doubt. And doubt has become exhausting. This shift does not announce itself publicly. It occurs quietly, in proximity, rather than proclamation. In private moments, rather than formal declarations. In spaces where decisions are prepared, rather than justified. Confidence begins to gather where uncertainty is absent. At the highest levels of power, this pressure sharpens. Decision-makers become isolated from certainty long before they lose control. Surrounded by ritual loyalty, they begin to doubt privately. Every choice feels consequential. Every failure feels personal. Every uncertainty lingers longer than it should. Loneliness becomes structural, and loneliness changes what feels persuasive. Under these conditions, reassurance acquires influence without asking for it. Not because it is wise, but because it calms something. Power cannot admit it feels. Calm becomes more convincing than competence. Certainty more attractive than correctness. This is where the strain becomes visible. Power begins to feel watched rather than supported. Decisions are made under a sense of invisible scrutiny. Silence becomes oppressive. The absence of reassurance grows louder than opposition ever was. This is not fear of rebellion. It is fear of being alone with responsibility. And in that space, composure begins to feel like salvation. Substitution does not arrive as opposition. It presents itself as steadiness, as quiet confidence, as something that does not challenge authority, but stabilizes it. It does not question the system. It promises to carry it through uncertainty. The figure who offers this does not need doctrine. They do not need legitimacy. They need only to appear untouched by the doubt consuming everyone else. That composure spreads. Access follows composure. Proximity follows access. Influence follows proximity. None of this feels illicit at first. It feels necessary, practical, protective. What follows does not feel like manipulation. It feels like relief. That is why it is accepted. That is why it gains access. That is why it becomes difficult to question. And this is where the danger becomes real. Because once reassurance enters the core of authority, it stops being optional. The system adjusts around it. Dependence forms quietly. Decisions begin to feel riskier without it. Absence becomes noticeable. Silence becomes unsettling. What began as comfort becomes expectation, and expectation hardens into reliance. This is how authority, already hollowed, begins to lean. Not on law, not on tradition, but on the presence that steadies its fear. It does not begin as domination. It begins as reassurance, and reassurance, once required, becomes power. Because when fear can no longer speak openly, whoever quiets it speaks instead. Before we continue, take a quiet moment. If you're listening from somewhere in the world right now, feel free to let us know in the comments where you are, and what time it is for you as this story reaches you. Some people listen late at night, others while working, traveling, or trying to slow their thoughts. There's no right moment for a story like this, only the one you happen to be in. And if this kind of long-form history helps you stay with the night, consider subscribing so you can find your way back again. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The figure enters a system already under strain, not fractured, not rebellious, still orderly, still functioning, still obeyed, but no longer absorbing consequence. Authority continues to issue decisions, yet those decisions no longer resolve what they touch. Each action completes itself formally, but something remains unsettled afterward. The weight does not lift. The doubt does not dissipate. This is the condition that invites substitution. Not because people are irrational, but because they are exhausted. The problem is not ignorance. It is overload. Every decision now carries an additional burden. The knowledge that nothing beyond the system will correct it later. No appeal upward. No deferred reckoning. no larger frame in which mistakes can be forgiven or absorbed. Responsibility has condensed, and condensed responsibility is heavy. This weight distorts behavior. People hesitate longer than necessary. They revisit decisions already made. They seek alignment rather than correctness, not because alignment is better, but because it distributes risk. Judgment becomes cautious. Caution becomes avoidance. Avoidance begins to look like prudence. This is where the figure becomes noticeable. He does not offer solutions. He does not argue. He does not intervene. What he offers is something far more valuable in this environment. He does not appear to carry the same weight. In rooms thick with second-guessing, his presence buffers consequence. Conversations that normally spiral toward anxiety slow down around him. The sense of imminent error softens. This is not because he removes risk. It is because he absorbs it emotionally. Others begin to experience his composure as shelter, not consciously, viscerally. People leave interactions with him feeling less exposed, less personally responsible for whatever follows, even though nothing concrete has changed. This is how reassurance begins to function as shielding, not against outcomes, against the feeling of authorship. The system notices this difference before it understands it. Decisions made in his presence feel easier to carry. Doubts feel quieter. The fear of having misjudged something important recedes. The relief is subtle, but it is addictive, because relief does not require explanation. It only requires repetition. Soon, his presence begins to precede decisions rather than follow them, not because he demands it, but because it feels safer to decide when the weight is already softened. This is the first distortion. Judgment is no longer evaluated by accuracy alone. It is evaluated by how bearable it feels. The system tells itself, this is harmless, even beneficial. Authority remains intact. Procedures are followed. No rules are broken. But something essential has shifted. Consequence is no longer faced directly. It is buffered. And buffering consequence always carries a cost. Errors that would normally provoke discomfort now pass without registering fully. Warnings feel less urgent. The internal signal that something is wrong weakens. This is not deception. It is adaptation. A system under pressure will always favor whatever reduces strain, even if it compromises clarity. The figure does not exploit this. The system does it to itself. Problems still exist. Risks remain unchanged, but their emotional impact is dampened. Reality retains its force. Perception does not. The system begins to trust the absence of discomfort as evidence of stability. This is the point where reassurance begins to interfere with judgment. not by replacing it, by softening its consequences. The figure has not yet become necessary, but he has become preferable, and preference, once established under pressure, rarely remains optional. The system approaches its first test, a moment where the comfort he provides will conflict with something that requires correction, a moment where choosing clarity will mean reintroducing strain. That decision has not yet been made, but the conditions for it are now fully in place. The first mistake does not arrive loudly. It arrives protected. A decision is made that should feel wrong, not catastrophic, not immoral, simply misaligned. A warning ignored, a concern postponed, a risk accepted that would normally provoke unease. This time the unease does not come. The room remains steady. No one panics. No one argues. The absence of discomfort is mistaken for correctness. This is the threshold. Correction depends on friction. When friction is buffered, errors lose urgency. The figure does not intervene. He does not need to. His presence has already done the work. The system learns something dangerous from this experience, that it is possible to proceed without paying the full psychological cost of judgment. That clarity can be delayed. That discomfort is optional. From this point on, decisions organize themselves around a new priority, not accuracy, containment. Information that unsettles is softened. Warnings are reframed as excessive. Doubt is treated as a failure of tone rather than a signal of risk. Nothing is silenced. Everything is filtered. Those who persist are not punished. They are described as destabilizing. This is how shielding replaces evaluation. The figure's role deepens without changing in form. He still offers no directives. He still claims no authority. But now his composure functions as a regulator. When conflict arises, the question is no longer, what is true? It is, what will preserve balance? This shift is not ideological. It is operational. Meetings are structured to minimize agitation. Conversations are deferred rather than confronted, not out of fear, out of fatigue. This is how buffering becomes dependency. The figure becomes necessary not because he is correct, but because he makes consequence feel distant. Removing him would not correct the distortion. It would expose it. The system senses this instinctively, and so it begins to protect the insulation it has built. Not through loyalty, through avoidance. Risk is acknowledged abstractly, but never allowed to register emotionally. The figure is no longer merely present. He is integrated. His composure has been mistaken for alignment with reality. And reality, when it intrudes, now feels like the problem. This is the final inversion. Truth becomes the disruptor. Correction becomes dangerous. Stability becomes the overriding value. The system tells itself it is being responsible. In truth, it is deferring responsibility. Judgment still exists. Intelligence remains. Authority continues to function. But all of it now operates under a condition it cannot articulate. Do not disturb the buffer. This is not corruption. It is a survival strategy adopted too early and trusted too completely. And once a system learns that it can function while insulated from consequence, it will resist anything that threatens to remove that insulation. This is how reassurance hardens into necessity, not through belief, not through coercion, but through the quiet realization that clarity now hurts more than error. From this point forward, the danger is no longer abstract. It has entered the decision-making process itself, and whatever follows will not feel like betrayal. It will feel like preservation. Once reassurance hardens into expectation, silence becomes dangerous. Up to this point, the figure's refusal to explain himself has been an asset. Ambiguity allowed others to project meaning without resistance. Calm functioned as shelter. Presence softened consequence. But belief has now formed, and belief demands performance. The first signs appear not in grand decisions, but in ordinary ones. Appointments, delays, allocations of attention. Small judgments that once passed unnoticed now carry weight because they occur in his orbit. A petition is delayed rather than denied. A warning is acknowledged but not acted upon. A concern is deferred because the moment does not feel right. Nothing here looks irrational. Every choice is defensible in isolation. But taken together, they reveal a new pattern. Decisions are no longer evaluated on merit alone. They are evaluated on alignment. Not ideological alignment, emotional alignment. The system begins to ask a new, unspoken question: does this choice preserve the equilibrium we have come to depend on? This is the first visible trade-off. Correction is postponed because it would reintroduce strain. Action is delayed because it would force confrontation. Responsibility is displaced because no one wants to be the one who breaks the calm. The figure does not intervene. And now, that non-intervention matters. His silence no longer reads as neutrality. It reads as permission. Those closest to him begin to act as if his calm implies approval. Decisions made in his presence are treated as implicitly validated. Outcomes are explained retroactively as part of a larger, unseen coherence. This is how silence forces action without instruction. The system fills the gap, but not consistently. Different people interpret the silence differently. One sees restraint, another sees caution, A third sees patience. Each acts accordingly. Conflicting expectations form. One faction delays action, believing patience is required. Another proceeds aggressively, believing confidence is expected. Both claim alignment with the same calm. This is the first crack. When projection multiplies, coordination falters. Signals no longer line up. Decisions no longer converge. Responsibility becomes harder to locate because authority has diffused into interpretation. Still, no one names the problem, because naming it would require questioning the structure that has provided relief. This is the bind. The figure has become necessary without becoming directive. He is central without being accountable. His silence stabilizes anxiety, but destabilizes coordination. The strain appears not as panic, but as friction. Small failures accumulate. Delays compound. Costs are absorbed unevenly. The people affected are not important enough to provoke alarm, but significant enough to register privately. Each incident is explained away. Temporary, contextual, unfortunate. But the explanations themselves are now doing work. They are protecting the calm. This is where belief quietly closes its loop. It no longer asks whether the interpretation is correct. It asks whether abandoning it would be survivable. Breaking the silence would force a reckoning. It would mean acknowledging that calm has been mistaken for guidance. It would mean accepting responsibility that has been carefully buffered. So the system adapts again. It narrows tolerance. Only decisions that do not threaten equilibrium advance. Only voices that do not introduce tension are amplified. Only outcomes that can be absorbed without visible strain are allowed to proceed. This is not yet enforcement, but it is selection. And selection always precedes force. The figure remains unchanged. But the system around him is no longer merely insulated. It is misaligned. The question is no longer how he influences the system. It is how long the system can continue to function while avoiding the consequences of that influence. Because something must break. Not because the figure is wrong, but because silence cannot coordinate reality indefinitely. What breaks first is not belief. It is coordination. Once interpretation replaces instruction, decisions that once converged begin to diverge. Responsibility spreads thin. Authority loses its ability to synchronize action across the whole. At first, this looks like inefficiency. Then it becomes exclusion. Certain matters bypass formal channels entirely. Delays are framed as prudence. Oversight is treated as excess. A complaint is acknowledged, then allowed to expire. A warning registers briefly and is set aside because acting on it would disturb the equilibrium. This is the first visible harm, not dramatic, but final. Someone absorbs the consequence of inaction. A livelihood is affected. A reputation suffers. A risk materializes that could have been mitigated earlier. No one intended this outcome, and that is precisely the problem. When harm occurs without intent, responsibility becomes difficult to assign. Each participant can point to reasonableness, context, or the absence of clear instruction. The figure remains silent. Now that silence is no longer ambiguous. It functions as cover. The system fragments into zones of interpretation, each convinced it is preserving stability. Correction becomes nearly impossible. To intervene now would require reopening decisions that have already produced cost. It would mean admitting that avoidance, not wisdom, shaped the outcome. So the system does what systems under strain always do. It justifies. The harm is reframed as necessary, unfortunate, but unavoidable. The explanation is not convincing, but it is sufficient to move on. This is how exclusion solidifies. Those affected are rendered peripheral. Their loss is absorbed quietly. The system continues, slightly narrowed, slightly hardened. This is the turning point. This is the turning point, because once exclusion enters procedure, reversal becomes costly. Silence is interpreted as confirmation that the narrowing is correct. Calm is treated as evidence that the harm was necessary. This is how belief completes its inversion. Originally, calm buffered anxiety. Now, calm justifies damage. The figure has become central without becoming accountable. He does not cause the harm, but the system now requires the harm to protect what he represents. Belief is no longer protective. It becomes extractive. The cost has entered the world, quietly, without spectacle, without intent, and because it arrived this way, it will not provoke immediate resistance. It will provoke adjustment. This is where the arc of belief ends, and where the arc of enforcement begins. The system does not respond to damage by questioning itself. It responds by formalizing what already happened. Once harm has occurred and been absorbed, the priority shifts. The question is no longer how to prevent it. It is how to ensure it does not destabilize what remains. This is where procedure enters, not as cruelty, as repair. Rules are clarified. Roles are defined more tightly. Authority is redistributed, not upward, but inward. Decisions that once depended on judgment are rerouted through process, because process does not hesitate. What had been informal becomes codified. The justification is simple and difficult to argue with. Clarity prevents confusion. Consistency prevents error. Distance prevents bias. No one calls this exclusion. They call it stabilization. The earlier harm is treated as a lesson, not a failure. Something went wrong because boundaries were unclear, because too many voices were involved, because discretion was exercised without alignment. The solution is not to restore discretion. It is to reduce it. Decision-making narrows. Review becomes conditional. Access is filtered. Participation is redefined in terms of usefulness rather than responsibility. This feels like progress. It produces smoother operation, fewer interruptions, faster outcomes. The system appears calmer than it has in some time. That calm is misleading, because what has changed is not understanding, it is tolerance. Certain disruptions are now assumed to be unavoidable. Certain costs are no longer examined closely. They are anticipated, budgeted, absorbed. Procedure does not eliminate harm. It manages its visibility. And management creates distance. Those affected by decisions become data points rather than interlocutors. Their losses are recorded, not addressed. Their objections are logged, not engaged. This is not malice. It is insulation. The figure remains present, still silent. But now his silence is no longer merely interpretive. It has been built into the structure itself. Decisions are justified not by reference to him directly, but by alignment with the equilibrium he represents. The system does not ask what he wants. It asks what will preserve the calm associated with him. Because once calm becomes an operational goal, truth becomes secondary. Correction becomes risky. Dissent becomes inefficient. What was once an emotional adjustment has now become an institutional one. Belief has been replaced by compliance. Reassurance by procedure. The system has not become authoritarian. It has become careful. Careful systems do not reverse easily. They accumulate safeguards. They privilege predictability over judgment. They treat uncertainty as a threat rather than a condition. And once uncertainty is framed as a threat, control follows naturally. No one announces this shift. It emerges quietly, reasonably, with broad consent, because at this stage the alternative feels worse. To reopen questions would mean reintroducing instability. To revisit harm would mean admitting that the calm was purchased at a cost, and costs already paid are easier to accept than to confront. This is the environment now taking shape, not belief, not devotion. Administration. The first thing that changes is not policy, it is memory. Once procedure becomes the primary response to harm, the past is no longer treated as something to be understood. It becomes something to be contained. Events are summarized. Context is reduced. Ambiguity is stripped away, not because it has been resolved, but because it complicates continuity. The system does not forget. It compresses. What remains are conclusions without deliberation, outcomes without their ethical residue, decisions without the uncertainty that produced them. Responsibility no longer points backward. It points downward. When questions arise, they are answered procedurally. When objections persist, they are redirected administratively. When concern becomes insistence, it is reframed as disruption. This is not punishment, it is categorization. Some concerns are labeled premature. Others are labeled emotional. A few are acknowledged as valid but deferred. The system remains responsive, but only within boundaries it defines. This is how dissent is neutralized without confrontation. It is not silenced. It is absorbed. Those closest to decision-making begin to notice a change in themselves. They speak differently. Less about right and wrong. More about feasibility. Less about obligation. More about risk. Judgment does not disappear. It retreats. People still feel unease. They still recognize imbalance, but the space to address it has narrowed. The language available to articulate it has thinned. Concern now sounds like inefficiency. Doubt sounds like delay. Moral hesitation sounds like incompetence. The system reads the reduction in friction as success. Fewer objections. Faster resolution. Smoother operation. But the reduction in friction is not proof of health. It is proof of accommodation. What has been lost is not conflict. It is correction. And correction, once delayed long enough, becomes impossible without rupture. The figure remains unchanged, still present, still silent, still silent, still associated with equilibrium. But now, his presence has acquired a different function. He no longer reassures by proximity alone. He reassures by precedent. Decisions are defended by reference to what preserved calm before. What worked once becomes the template. What deviates from it becomes suspect. This is the irreversible turn. Because once precedent replaces judgment, the system begins to protect itself against learning. Learning introduces instability. Stability has become the goal. This is not a conspiracy. It is conservation. Institutions do not seek power for its own sake. They seek continuity. And continuity requires minimizing surprise. The cost is borne quietly. By those who experience the consequences of decisions, but have no access to their rationale. By those whose lives are altered by process without ever being addressed as participants. By those whose suffering is registered statistically rather than morally. The system does not ignore them. It accounts for them. Accounting is not the same as care. The first visible failure is not dramatic. It does not arrive as exposure, collapse, or scandal. It arrives as misalignment between consequence and explanation. Decisions continue to be made. Procedures continue to function. Authority continues to speak in the language of necessity and stability, but the outcomes begin to feel wrong in a way that cannot be corrected internally. Not immoral, misfitted. Actions produce effects that no longer match the justifications offered for them. Harm appears where none was intended. Protection creates vulnerability. Efforts to preserve calm begin generating the very instability they were meant to prevent. At first, this is treated as noise, anomalies, edge cases, temporary distortions. The system responds the way it has learned to respond, by refining process, by narrowing criteria, by clarifying thresholds, by issuing guidance. Each adjustment is reasonable. Each one makes sense in isolation. But together, they reveal something new. The system is no longer responding to reality. It is responding to its own responses. Feedback loops tighten. Decisions are evaluated by procedural alignment rather than lived impact. Harm is translated into metrics that preserve order while obscuring experience. No one denies the harm. They reclassify it. This is where protection turns selective. Certain harms are addressed quickly because they threaten continuity. Others linger unresolved because they complicate coherence. The distinction is not moral. It is functional. What matters is not who is affected. It is whether the effect can be absorbed. Responsibility shifts shape. Earlier, it was shared uneasily. Now, it is distributed strategically. Each actor can explain their role. Each decision can be justified locally. No one appears to have acted incorrectly, and yet the outcome remains damaging. This produces a quiet crisis, not of legitimacy, of credibility. People still comply. They still follow rules. But confidence thins privately. Those closest to the machinery notice the distance between intent and effect widening. They begin to anticipate consequences they are not empowered to address. This creates tension, not rebellion. Anticipatory restraint. Language becomes cautious. Documentation multiplies, not to improve outcomes, but to survive association with them. The figure remains present, still associated with equilibrium, still untouched by consequence. But his function shifts again. He becomes a reference point for acceptable risk. If a decision aligns with the calm he represents, it feels safer, even if it produces harm. If it disrupts that calm, it feels dangerous, even if it might correct course. This is how judgment narrows. Correction begins to look reckless. Stability begins to look virtuous. The system has not become cruel. It has become cautious. And caution elevated above care has consequences. The first is delay. Problems are acknowledged, but postponed. Harms are documented, but unresolved. Warnings are noted, but deprioritized. Time becomes the primary buffer. If enough time passes without collapse, decisions are retroactively justified. Survival is treated as success. Endurance becomes validation. This logic is seductive and dangerous because it converts persistence into proof. People adapt. Expectations shrink. Suffering normalizes. Not because harm is accepted, but because the cost of addressing it has become too high. This is where the fracture deepens. Not in belief. In trust. Trust that harm will be corrected rather than managed. Trust that calm is a means, not the goal. Once that trust weakens, behavior changes. People comply, but they stop investing. They follow rules, but they stop caring whether outcomes improve. The system continues to function, but without commitment. And a system without commitment can persist for a long time. It just cannot heal. This is the condition. Chapter 5 leaves us in not collapse, not rebellion. A working structure that has lost its capacity for correction. Once correction becomes costly, justification changes shape. The system no longer asks whether an outcome is right. It asks whether it is survivable. Explanations now follow consequence. Outcomes arrive first. Rationales are constructed afterward. Language adjusts to fit results that cannot be reversed. No one is lying. They are adapting. Responsibility diffuses across roles, departments, procedures. This diffusion protects individuals. It weakens accountability. At this stage, harm becomes administrative. It is processed as an operational byproduct. Reports are filed. Reviews are scheduled. Adjustments are proposed. But nothing fundamental changes. The system has learned how to metabolize damage. Moral language thins. Care becomes compliance. Ethics becomes adherence to procedure rather than attention to outcome. This is not cynicism. It is exhaustion. Caring no longer produces leverage. Deviating from process carries risk. So people choose predictability. Engagement becomes performative. Initiative becomes dangerous. Stability is no longer a means. It is the objective. The figure remains intact, calm, reassuring, untouched by cost. He is no longer merely a source of equilibrium. He becomes a shield. As long as he remains, uncertainty feels contained. As long as uncertainty feels contained, outcomes are tolerated. This is not belief. It is dependency. Removing him would introduce more risk than keeping him, not because he is correct, but because he stabilizes expectation. This is how protection becomes preservation, not of truth, of arrangement. Warnings now feel disruptive. Criticism feels destabilizing. The issue is no longer accuracy, it is impact. Does this challenge preserve continuity or threaten it? When calm becomes the metric, correction becomes suspect. This is the irreversible trade-off. The system chooses endurance over repair. From the outside, nothing appears broken. From the inside, adjustment has stopped. Costs are stored rather than addressed. Pain is softened through delay. Responsibility is buffered through structure. Everyone can explain their part. No one can change the whole. This produces a dangerous equilibrium, not because it is unstable, but because it is stable in the wrong direction. Survival becomes proof. Duration becomes justification. By now, the system is no longer correcting error. It is defending continuity, and defense changes incentives. Truth becomes negotiable. Care becomes optional. Silence becomes prudent. This is the lock. Failure will not arrive as collapse. It will arrive as accumulation. And accumulation, once ignored long enough, does not invite reform. It forces reckoning. By now, the system is no longer correcting error. It is defending continuity. The failure has already occurred. It no longer needs to announce itself. It is carried forward quietly through language, process, and habit. Tolerance has replaced judgment. Harm is no longer denied. It is contextualized. Loss is no longer unexpected. It is normalized. Failure is no longer examined. It is absorbed. This is how systems continue after fairness becomes negotiable. They stop asking whether outcomes are just. They ask whether outcomes are sustainable. And sustainability has a different moral threshold. At this stage, responsibility becomes diffuse by design. No single decision causes the harm. No single actor authorizes it. No single moment can be isolated as the turning point. Everything unfolds through aggregation. Small permissions. Minor exceptions. Temporary measures that never expire. Each step feels reasonable. Each adjustment appears limited. Each choice is defensible on its own. Together, they produce a structure in which no one can clearly say who is accountable. This is not evasion. It is insulation. When responsibility is spread thin enough, it stops producing guilt. It produces distance. People continue to act, but they no longer feel authored by their actions. They follow protocol, meet requirements, fulfill roles. And because the system still functions, this feels like order rather than decay. This is where the figure's silence matters differently. Earlier, silence allowed projection. Now, It allows avoidance. Questions that once demanded answers are redirected. Concerns that once required confrontation are softened into reassurance. Conflicts are delayed by reference rather than resolved by decision. Nothing is forbidden, but nothing is clarified. The result is not chaos. It is stagnation. The system grows quieter, not because it is healthy, but because it has learned which questions generate disruption and which phrases prevent it. Language becomes careful. Critique is translated into process. Moral weight is converted into information. This is not oppression. It is administration. And administration, once it replaces judgment, expands rapidly. Efficiency becomes virtue. Continuity becomes proof. Survival becomes justification. Fairness is no longer measured by outcome. It is measured by consistency. If rules are applied uniformly, the result is treated as acceptable, even when the result is damaging. Procedure absolves consequence. This is the most dangerous moral shift of the system. Because cruelty does not require intent when it has process, harm does not require malice when it has momentum. Those who suffer are not ignored. They are categorized. Their experiences are recorded. Their complaints are acknowledged. But acknowledgement does not lead to correction. It leads to management. Suffering becomes data. Pain becomes variable. Lives become inputs. This is how moral weight is neutralized. At this stage, removing the stabilizing figure becomes unthinkable, not because he is indispensable, but because his absence would force the system to confront everything it has postponed. Without him, uncertainty would return. With uncertainty, responsibility would reconcentrate. And with responsibility, blame would become unavoidable. So protection intensifies. Not openly, structurally. Access tightens. Criticism is redirected. Concerns are reframed as risks to stability. The system does not declare that he must remain. It behaves as if disruption would be catastrophic, and behavior, repeated long enough, becomes policy. This is where legitimacy quietly expires. Authority no longer depends on trust. It depends on endurance. As long as collapse is delayed, every compromise appears rational. But endurance is not consent. Stability is not health. What remains is a system that cannot correct itself without threatening its own survival. Every call for accountability now sounds reckless. Every demand for fairness feels destabilizing. This is the final inversion. Correction becomes the threat. Maintenance becomes the good. And once that inversion is complete, the system enters a new phase. Not collapse, not tyranny, entrenchment. From here forward, change will not arrive through argument. It will arrive through rupture. Because systems that can no longer absorb responsibility eventually encounter it in concentrated form. And when that moment comes, reassurance will no longer be enough. For now, the structure holds. The language remains calm. The processes continue. And that calm is exactly what makes what follows unavoidable. Resistance did not begin as refusal. It began as misalignment. People did not suddenly decide to oppose the system. They continued to participate. They followed procedures. They complied with requirements. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. But internally, something had shifted. Actions no longer resolved into belief. Decisions no longer settled the mind. Compliance no longer produced conviction. The system still functioned. The people inside it no longer did. This is the stage most analyses miss. They look for protest. They look for outrage. They look for defiance. What they should be looking for is withdrawal, not withdrawal from rules, withdrawal from care. People began to do what was required without investing themselves in the outcome. They met expectations precisely, but without attachment. They fulfilled roles without identifying with them. They stopped arguing not because they agreed, but because argument no longer felt useful. This was not apathy. It was self-protection. When responsibility becomes dangerous, the safest move is to narrow exposure. When authorship produces anxiety rather than meaning, the instinct is not to rebel, but to minimize the self's presence in decisions. So people learned how to be correct without being committed. They followed the letter of instruction. They avoided interpretation. They stayed within bounds. The system rewarded this behavior. Predictability increased. Friction decreased. Processes moved faster. From an administrative perspective, this looked like improvement. From the inside, it felt hollow. The system had learned how to manage obedience. It had not learned how to detect indifference. Indifference does not violate rules. It empties them. A rule followed without belief still functions. But it no longer binds. It no longer persuades. It no longer stabilizes internally. This is where legitimacy begins to dissolve silently. Earlier, authority relied on belief. Then it relied on reassurance. Now, it relies on submission. Not submission as fear. Submission as habit. People stop asking whether decisions are right. They ask whether decisions are required. That shift matters, because once requirement replaces judgment, moral responsibility begins to feel like liability. Choosing becomes risky. Interpreting becomes dangerous. Initiative becomes exposure. So, initiative disappears. People wait to be told. They defer upward. They look for cover. This creates the illusion of order. Everything moves. Nothing resolves. At this stage, resistance has not yet found language. It has not named itself. It has not organized. But it is already present. It lives in hesitation, in silence, in the careful avoidance of responsibility that cannot be defended. People begin to sense that the safest position is not disagreement, but invisibility. To be unremarkable, to be compliant, to be forgettable. This is not cowardice. It is adaptation, and adaptation, once widespread, changes the system itself. Systems built on participation require belief to function well. When belief evaporates, they continue operating only by increasing control, tightening oversight, and narrowing tolerance. The people inside feel this immediately, not as oppression, as narrowing. Fewer choices feel safe. Fewer questions feel permitted. Fewer actions feel neutral. Everything carries risk. So procedure becomes the shelter. It absorbs blame. It diffuses responsibility. It allows individuals to say truthfully that they did not decide anything. They only followed the process. This is where withdrawal deepens into permanence. People detach not just emotionally, but structurally. They stop identifying with roles. They stop seeing outcomes as reflections of themselves. They become operators rather than participants. The system adapts again. It formalizes behavior. It narrows tolerance. It increases oversight. Each move is reasonable. Each move accelerates the same outcome. Because the more the system tightens, the less belief it requires. And the less belief it requires, the less belief it receives. This feedback loop is quiet, but relentless. Eventually, something becomes unmistakable. The system is no longer sustained by shared conviction. It is sustained by managed compliance. At that point, resistance has already changed form. It is no longer about disagreement. It is about distance. People do not try to change the system. They try to survive it. They look for exits that do not look like exits. Paths that preserve stability while reducing exposure. They disengage internally while remaining externally functional. This is the final transformation. Resistance is no longer visible as opposition. It becomes absence, not absence of bodies, absence of belief. And once belief has withdrawn, it does not return because it is requested. It only returns if meaning is restored. And meaning cannot be restored by force. The system will discover this too late. Because what looks like calm is now vacancy. What looks like order is now inertia. What looks like stability is now delay. The moment dissent finally appears, it will not arrive as argument. It will arrive as exit. Not dramatic. Not collective. Not announced. But decisive. And by then, persuasion will no longer be possible. Only management. Withdrawal does not announce itself. It leaves no slogans. It raises no banners. It violates no rules. That is why it takes so long to be recognized. The system continues to look stable because participation continues. Forms are submitted. Meetings are held. Decisions are executed. Outputs are delivered. From the outside, alignment appears intact. But alignment is not commitment. Alignment can be performed. What the system mistakes for consent is increasingly just compliance stripped of meaning. People are no longer invested in outcomes. They are invested in safety. The safest position is not agreement. It is neutrality. So neutrality spreads, not as indecision, as discipline. People learn which questions are welcome and which are dangerous. They learn how to phrase concerns as technical issues rather than moral ones. Doubt is reframed as clarification. Clarification is reframed as efficiency. Nothing is challenged directly. Everything is softened. This is how resistance learns to survive, because open opposition would require belief, and belief has already been exhausted. The system does not notice the shift immediately. Why would it? Metrics improve. Disruptions decrease. Predictability increases. But what improves is submission. Not submission as loyalty. Submission as disengagement. What the system requires is not agreement. It is submission. Agreement demands belief. Submission demands only behavior. And behavior, when detached from belief, becomes hollow. This is the moment legitimacy collapses internally. No one needs to say it aloud. Everyone senses it. Decisions begin to feel arbitrary, even when rational. Authority feels procedural, even when lawful. Outcomes feel imposed rather than chosen. A peculiar moral atmosphere takes hold. People stop asking whether something is right. They ask whether it is defensible. They stop asking whether something should be done. They ask whether it will be punished. Responsibility is no longer experienced as purpose. It is experienced as risk. So responsibility is avoided. This avoidance reshapes institutions from the inside. Initiative declines. Judgment narrows. Interpretation disappears. Everything must be documented. Everything must be approved. Everything must be reversible. Not because the system is evil, because it is anxious. And anxious systems do not trust discretion. They trust procedure. procedure becomes shelter. It absorbs blame. It diffuses responsibility. It allows individuals to say truthfully that they did not decide anything. They only followed the process. This is where withdrawal deepens. People detach, not just emotionally, but structurally. They stop identifying with roles. They stop seeing outcomes as reflections of themselves. They become operators rather than participants. The system adapts again. It formalizes behavior. It narrows tolerance. It increases oversight. Each move is reasonable. Each move accelerates the same outcome, because the more the system tightens, the less belief it requires, and the less belief it requires, the less belief it receives. This feedback loop is quiet, but relentless. Eventually, something becomes unmistakable. The system is no longer sustained by shared conviction. It is sustained by managed compliance. Resistance has already changed form. It is no longer disagreement. It is distance. People do not try to change the system. They try to survive it. They look for exits that do not look like exits, paths that preserve stability while reducing exposure. They disengage internally while remaining externally functional. This is the final transformation. Resistance is no longer visible as opposition. It becomes absence, not absence of bodies, absence of belief. And once belief has withdrawn, it does not return because it is requested. It returns only if meaning is restored. And meaning cannot be restored by force. The system will discover this too late, because what looks like calm is now vacancy. What looks like order is now inertia. What looks like stability is now delay. The moment dissent finally appears, it will not arrive as argument. It will arrive as exit. Not dramatic, not collective, not announced, but decisive. And by then, persuasion will no longer be possible. Only management. Once appeal becomes illegible, something subtle but decisive changes. Power no longer asks whether it is justified. It asks whether it is secure. This is not a moral shift. It is a functional one. When authority cannot be corrected from outside itself, it begins to correct for exposure rather than error. Error invites revision. Exposure invites containment. So containment becomes the priority, not openly, procedurally. At first, this looks like caution. Safeguards are introduced. Thresholds are raised. Verification multiplies. Each measure appears reasonable in isolation. Each is explained as prevention, not punishment. But prevention changes the moral structure of action. Instead of responding to harm, the system responds to the possibility of harm. Instead of judging acts, it judges patterns. Instead of addressing outcomes, it manages probabilities. This is where fear replaces reason without announcing itself as fear. The system insists it is optimizing. It is minimizing risk. But risk, once elevated to the primary concern, has no natural limit. There is always more uncertainty to eliminate, more variance to reduce, more behavior to standardize. And because appeal is gone, there is no place to argue that the cure has exceeded the disease. This is the irreversible turn, not when dissent is punished, when dissent becomes unintelligible. Questions are redirected, concerns are reframed as inefficiencies. Language shifts. Responsibility becomes liability. Judgment becomes exposure. Conscience becomes unpredictability. These are not accusations. They are classifications. And classifications do not argue. They sort. Once sorted, treatment follows automatically. No malice is required, only procedure. This is where quiet power completes its transformation. It no longer needs loyalty. It needs compliance. Compliance is easier to secure than belief. Belief demands persuasion. Compliance demands friction. Make resistance costly enough, complex enough, exhausting enough, and most people adapt. Not because they agree, because they cannot afford not to. This adaptation is mistaken for consent. Participation continues. Output continues. The system reads this as confirmation. But beneath it, something hollows out. People stop internalizing responsibility. They stop seeing decisions as reflections of themselves. They think in terms of rules survived rather than choices made. This is not passivity, it is survival logic. Judgment is unpredictable. Roles are manageable, so roles expand. Discretion contracts. Everything is specified, not because leaders are cruel, because impersonality feels fair. Impersonality distributes harm without appearing to choose it. This is the comfort of systems without appeal. Once harm is procedural, it becomes defensible. Once defensible, it becomes normalized. Once normalized, it becomes invisible. This is how power becomes quiet, not silent. Quiet. It shapes options rather than issuing commands. It narrows possibility rather than forbidding action. People do not feel dominated. They feel constrained. And constraint without a clear oppressor is difficult to resist. Because who do you confront? A policy, a model, a forecast. There is no face to accuse, only process. This is where certainty becomes dangerous. Certainty without appeal is indistinguishable from arrogance. Not because those in power believe they are superior, but because the system has no mechanism to hear that it might be wrong. Correction becomes internal. Calibration replaces accountability. The system adjusts endlessly while remaining insulated from judgment. This is the world produced when authority answers only to itself, not collapsing, not tyrannical. Sealed. And sealed systems do not reform. They endure until they break, or until people leave. Not through argument, not through persuasion, through abandonment. Quietly, all at once, what disappeared was not belief. What disappeared was somewhere to send responsibility. In earlier systems, responsibility could be deferred. It could be absorbed by God, by fate, by tradition, by history's judgment. Even when individuals acted, they did so within a structure that promised explanation beyond the moment. Failure could be forgiven. Suffering could be justified. Error could be folded into a larger account that did not end with the individual. That buffer was gone. Responsibility condensed. It did not vanish. It moved inward. Every decision landed closer to the person who made it. Every outcome felt more final. Every action echoed without insulation. There was no longer a place to appeal beyond the system itself, and the system, increasingly procedural, did not forgive. This produced a new kind of anxiety, not fear of punishment, fear of authorship. To act meant to own consequences without appeal. To choose meant accepting that nothing beyond the world would intervene, soften, or redeem the outcome. Even correct decisions carried weight, because correctness no longer guaranteed meaning. Responsibility stopped feeling like moral seriousness and started feeling like exposure. People hesitated. Not because they lacked values, but because values no longer came with protection. Judgment had to be exercised without assurance. Conviction expressed without guarantee. Action taken without deferral. The cost was psychological. Decisions took longer. Risk tolerance narrowed. Initiative slowed. This was not decadence. It was caution under unbuffered consequence, and sustained caution reshapes behavior. The first move was narrowing. People reduced the range of decisions they were willing to make. They avoided ambiguity. They preferred choices defensible procedurally rather than morally. If an action could be justified as following policy, it felt safer than one requiring interpretation. Procedure became shelter, not because it was cowardly, because it redistributed responsibility. When a rule decides, no individual has to. When a process determines outcome, guilt thins. This was not ethical failure. It was adaptation. But adaptation has consequences. As responsibility routed into procedure, judgment did not disappear, but it displaced. moral reasoning gave way to compliance reasoning. The question shifted from, "Is this right?" to, "Is this defensible?" Defensibility replaced conviction. This mattered. Conviction binds the self to action. Defensibility protects the self from consequence. The more responsibility condensed, the more people sought defensibility. The more they sought defensibility, the more procedure expanded to meet it. And the more procedure expanded, the less space remained for judgment. A feedback loop formed. Responsibility produced anxiety. Anxiety produced procedure. Procedure produced distance. Distance reduced felt responsibility. At first, this felt like relief. Decisions no longer felt existential. Outcomes no longer felt personal. Failure could be attributed to process rather than choice. But relief carried a cost. When responsibility diffuses, ownership weakens. People continue to act, but stop experiencing themselves as authors of action. Responsibility becomes a threat, not because people reject it, but because it arrives without buffer, forgiveness, or appeal. It exposes rather than dignifies, so people learn to avoid it, not by refusal, by redirection. They ask for approval, escalate decisions upward, defer judgment laterally, document compliance meticulously. Each move is sensible. Together, they alter the moral architecture. Responsibility is no longer carried. It is managed, and management transforms its meaning. What was once ethical seriousness becomes personal risk. To take responsibility is to stand alone with consequence. To refuse it is to remain protected by structure. This defines the modern moral environment. Not indifference, not cynicism, responsibility without address. When responsibility has nowhere to go, it displaces into forms, into audits, into protocols, into systems designed to absorb shock. This is where the future stops being guided. It becomes audited. Action is evaluated not by intention, but by compliance with expectation. This is not moral collapse. It is reconfiguration. And the cost of that reconfiguration has not yet fully appeared, because what comes next is not rebellion. It is exhaustion. Exhaustion accumulates quietly beneath correct behavior. People comply, meet expectations, follow procedures. On the surface, the system appears functional, even stable. But internally, something erodes. Not belief, not loyalty. Capacity. The capacity to carry responsibility without relief. When every decision feels final, every mistake unrecoverable, every action unjustifiable beyond itself, psychological cost compounds. People conserve themselves. They narrow engagement not because they care less, but because caring has become too expensive. Responsibility turns inward again, distorted. Instead of ownership, it becomes self-protection. People stop asking whether an action is good. They ask whether it is safe, defensible, explainable. Later, once safety replaces judgment, morality thins, not disappears, thins. The second move is deferral. Responsibility is postponed. Decisions escalated. Meetings multiply. Time is bought in hope that clarity will arrive from elsewhere. But clarity does not arrive. Because the system no longer contains a place where responsibility can resolve, only places where it can distribute. Procedure grows dense. Forms appear. Checklists multiply. Documentation expands. Not because people love bureaucracy, because bureaucracy absorbs blame. Procedure records compliance, proves diligence, demonstrates alignment. Alignment protects. Judgment exposes. The third move is diffusion. Responsibility spreads so widely that no one feels it fully. Decisions are collective. Accountability is nominal. Outcomes belong to process, not people. When harm occurs, no one intended it. When injustice persists, no one chose it. When suffering continues, no one authored it. The system did. This is not corruption. It is structure. A structure built to survive responsibility without appeal. But survival has consequences. When responsibility diffuses, moral urgency fades. Harm becomes procedural. Suffering becomes a metric. People feel this. In hesitation. In risk aversion. In fear of standing out. Because standing out now means standing alone. This is why resistance does not appear as rebellion. It appears as withdrawal. People disengage emotionally before they disengage behaviorally. They comply without commitment, follow without assent. This detachment feels rational, even healthy, until it spreads. Then the system loses something it cannot replace: internal assent. Order remains. Compliance remains. Function continues. But meaning collapses inward. This is the paradox of procedural morality. It stabilizes action while exhausting the actors, prevents chaos while producing fatigue. And fatigue does not radicalize. It numbs. Numbness is dangerous because it is adaptive. It allows systems to persist long after legitimacy is gone. Harm continues without protest. Responsibility circulates endlessly without landing. This is the modern condition. People are not oppressed. They are depleted. They are not coerced. They are managed. They are not immoral. They are tired. And tired people do not revolt. They endure. They withdraw. They comply, until compliance itself becomes unsustainable. This is the state inherited by the final phase of the arc you are tracing. Not belief, not authority, not power. Responsibility stretched past its limit. What comes next is not an argument. It is a reckoning with a system that cannot correct itself, because no one inside it can afford to take responsibility for doing so. That is the danger. Not that responsibility disappeared, but that everyone learned how to survive without carrying it. And once that happens, repair becomes nearly impossible. What this story reveals is not a collapse of belief, or a corruption of power, or the rise of an unusual individual. It reveals a sequence that begins when authority continues to function after it has stopped convincing. When reassurance becomes more valuable than truth, when responsibility loses its destination and begins to circulate instead. By the time figures like Rasputin appear, the essential work has already been done, not by mysticism, not by manipulation, not by ignorance, but by exhaustion. A society that can no longer tolerate uncertainty does not look for wisdom. It looks for relief. And relief does not need to be correct. It only needs to be calming. That is the condition you have been tracing from the beginning. Not decadence, not superstition, not irrationality, but a slow narrowing of what people can psychologically bear. When belief fractures, responsibility condenses. When responsibility overwhelms, it diffuses. When diffusion becomes unlivable, systems harden. And when systems harden without conviction, presence begins to matter more than legitimacy. This is why history so often misreads moments like this. We look backward and see individuals. We see scandals. We see excess. We see failure of character. But what we miss is the pressure that made those individuals possible. The environment that rewarded calm over truth. The structure that punished correction more than error. Rasputin did not create the weakness of the Russian court. He entered it. He did not replace authority. He filled the silence left when authority could no longer speak honestly. And that silence was not empty. It was dense with fear, with uncertainty, with the unbearable weight of decisions that could no longer be justified upward. This is the quiet tragedy at the center of the story. Power did not fall because it believed in the wrong things. It fell because it could no longer believe in anything strongly enough to act without reassurance. And once reassurance becomes the currency of survival, it will be supplied by whoever can offer it, regardless of truth, competence, or consequence. That is not a Russian story. It is a human one, and it does not end with Rasputin. The most unsettling part of this story is not how strange it becomes. It is how familiar it feels. Because nothing here required madness. Nothing required mass belief. Nothing required deception on a grand scale. What it required was a system pushed past its capacity to carry responsibility honestly. When that happens, people do not suddenly abandon reason. They narrow it. They do not reject truth. They postpone it. They do not surrender agency. They shelter it. This is how reassurance becomes power, not through force, not through ideology, but through relief. Relief from having to decide, relief from having to justify, relief from having to stand alone with consequences that no longer feel containable. Rasputin was not dangerous because he lied. He was dangerous because he allowed others not to decide. He absorbed uncertainty. He slowed panic. He made unbearable moments feel survivable. And once survival becomes the highest priority, almost anything that offers it will be protected. That is the final pattern. Systems do not fall when they are challenged. They fall when they are protected from correction. When error is easier to live with than truth. When calm matters more than consequence. When presence outweighs legitimacy. By then, the damage is already done, because the structure no longer knows how to recover without shattering the very reassurance it depends on. This is why figures like Rasputin are always misread. They are treated as causes. They are remembered as anomalies. They are blamed for outcomes they did not design, but they are not the origin of the failure. They are the signal that failure has already become necessary, and that is the warning buried in this story. Not about mysticism, not about manipulation, not about one man, but about one man, but about what happens when responsibility has nowhere left to go, because when that happens, history does not ask whether relief is true. It only asks whether it works. And by the time that question becomes dominant, the answer no longer matters.